Okay, so today we will discuss our last poem of the semester by Alexander Pope, the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. As you may know from the introductory material, Dr. Arbuthnot was a real person. He was a friend of both Swift and Pope. He had served earlier as the physician to Queen Anne, which was a position, of course, of great respect and great renown. He was, in fact, for his age, a remarkable physician. He was also a fine poet, a good satirist. He was a an important person in shaping public policy for a long time. He was one of those Renaissance men that we encounter sometimes, and a dear friend of Alexander Pope's. When we read this poem, there are some things that will seem familiar to us. We'll see Pope settling some of the scores with some of his enemies, particularly Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, whose poetry we read earlier in the semester, and also a fellow named John Harvey, who appears in this work and he appears in some others. He was a bit of a statesman and a courtier, and he seemed to have an incredibly refined ability uh, to flatter those in power and to annoy those who were not. And he became an enemy not only of Alexander Pope's, but also of Henry Fielding, a novelist that we're not addressing, but somebody who's very important for our age. As we're reading the poem, though, I want us to focus on something other than Pope's attacks. This is in some ways the most personal of all the poems that we'll read this semester. The speaker here is very clearly, as we know from the title, not a persona that Pope creates, but Pope himself. He is writing this, as he tells us, from Twickenham, which was an estate that he built just a few miles outside of London on the Thames. Because of his religion, remember Pope was Catholic, he couldn't own the land. That was one of the civil rights that was denied him because of his religion, and instead he rented it. But he had a long-term rental for about 30 years, and he spent what would seem to us to be an inordinate amount of money creating this little oasis. It wasn't really a country estate in the way that a nobleman would have a country estate. It was about 10 acres, so it was actually quite small. But Pope he was a fine landscape architect. He was a fine painter, and he designed this as his oasis, as his escape. Uh, he built his famous grotto, which was um, a kind of artificial cave where he used to sit and watch the Thames, and where he wrote a good bit of his poetry. And I want us to keep that idea of a country home and of a kind of uh, uh, pastoral escape in mind as we're reading it. There are things here uh, that we'll see from a different perspective than we've seen in other literature. If we think of the writer of um, in Swift, who we met in A Tale of a Tub, that sort of desperate Grub Street fellow who was writing to survive. In some ways, we meet him again in this poem in the beginning. He is all of the writers who are showing up at Pope's home to ask for his help. By this time, Pope was a famous writer. He had made his fortune through his translations of Homer. He was somebody who was very influential in the publishing world, and it seems in the beginning that he is just inundated by all these requests from these struggling, desperate writers who are seeking his assistance. And he tries to be polite. He tries to help them, but he is also becoming frustrated, maybe in the same way that established musicians become frustrated when they're inundated with all of their followers, the amateur musicians who just want them to listen to something that they've recorded. They just want somebody to help give them a break, and we find that frustration in this work as well. It's kind of the opposite side of the Grub Street coin from what we saw in Swift. And of course, we see Pope settling some of his scores, and we see some of the vicious satire emerging. But that's not what I want us to focus on. Instead, I want us to focus on this work as a personal reflection, and I want us to focus on the relationship that we sense between Pope and Arbuthnot. There's an old literary tradition, uh, and it's sometimes the tradition of that's referred to as the physician of the mind, uh, and we can trace this back to antecedents in ancient Greece. We can find a lot of representations in the 18th century. And the idea is that the writer has a physician, sometimes someone that they will correspond with, who helps regulate their passions. He provides for them, in other words, a kind of uh, the same kind of service that we might find through therapy. Arbuthnot becomes the physician not only of Pope's body, but also the physician of the mind. Uh, Arbuthnot, of course, is not actually corresponding with Pope in this text. Instead, it's Pope imagining what Arbuthnot might say to him. There's a dialogue of what Pope might hear from his friend. And I want us to think about how Pope imagines Arbuthnot, the role that Arbuthnot plays within this poem, and how Pope benefits from it. To get us started down that path, I want us to think about the psychological or emotional state of the poet of Pope in the beginning of the poem when he's asking his servant John, and it'd be John Searle, who actually was a servant to Alexander Pope, to close things off and to keep all these people from bothering him. And where Pope ends up in these expressions of, if not a hopefulness, maybe a sense of, of gratitude in the way that he addresses Arbuthnot at the very end of the poem. And I want us to think about how this dialogue, even if it's imagined dialogue, provides a psychological benefit uh, to the poet. And I want us to use that to try to pull together some strings that we've been holding since the beginning of the semester, and think about those relationships between art, uh, wit, and well-being. The idea of literature providing a kind of practical guidance, maybe something that we would all benefit from now. But that'll be our task for tomorrow when we meet in our discussion board. I look forward uh, to hearing all of your ideas, or reading all of your ideas tomorrow, and I shall see you all then. Okay, take care.